The words hit like a slap. The air was hot and heavy with summer exhaust, and the sidewalk outside the rusty spur bar buzzed with low laughter, cigarette smoke, and cheap beer. 84-year-old Harold Hank Whitaker hadn't meant to get so close to the row of gleaming Harleys, but the narrow path left little room. As he passed, the corner of his coat brushed a chrome handlebar just enough to catch attention. "You deaf too?" The biker stood tall and broad-shouldered, with a black leather vest stretched across his chest and a scorpion tattoo writhing on his neck. His friends leaned back in their seats, smirking behind mirrored sunglasses. Hank turned, hands raised in apology. "Didn't mean to," but the shove came fast and hard. The pavement cracked against his hip. Pain shot through his leg as he hit the ground, and his cane clattered onto the concrete beside him. Time seemed to slow. A loaf of sourdough he'd just bought rolled out of the torn grocery bag and stopped near the biker's boot. No one moved. Someone laughed. Flat on his side, Hank winced as he looked up at the biker mark, Spike Kowalski. The man barely glanced at him before turning back to his beer, muttering something to the others that made them howl. It wasn't just the fall, it was the silence, the indifference. Dozens of passers-by saw what happened, but they looked away or pulled out their phones like it was entertainment. The world moved on, and Hank was left on the ground, his dignity shattered more than his bruised bones. This wasn't Normandy. This wasn't Korea. But somehow this humiliation burned deeper. He'd spent 3 decades in the Army's Mechanical Corps, keeping tanks alive in hellish terrain, surviving both war and time. He'd buried comrades and marched in honor. Yet here in the country he served, he was just another old man on the sidewalk. He pushed himself upright slowly, one hand clutching his hip, the other reaching for his cane. The bread, now dirty and flattened, rested on his knee like a silent symbol of something lost. He sat on the cold edge of a bus stop bench, the bar's laughter still ringing in his ears. And then with effort, he reached into his coat pocket. An old flip phone, scratched, sturdy, still working. One number, one purpose. His thumb hovered over the button marked Eagle 6. Then without another word, he pressed it and waited. 10 seconds of silence passed, just enough time for the signal to register, just enough time for the right people to take notice. Hank closed the flip phone with a quiet snap and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. He leaned back against the cold bench, staring at the sidewalk, his hands resting lightly on the bruised loaf of bread beside him. The noise from the bar drifted over the shouts, engines, laughter, but none of it touched him anymore. He just waited. 5 minutes ticked by. Nothing. Doubt started to creep in. Maybe it had been too long. Maybe David had moved on, was stationed too far unreachable. Maybe the number didn't even work anymore. Maybe Hank really was just an old man with a broken hip, a crushed loaf of bread, and no one left who cared. Then he heard it. A low, distant hum, steady, rhythmic, mechanical. At first it blended into the city's usual murmur. A passing plane, maybe. Construction. But Hank knew better. That thrum didn't come from the street. It came from the skunk. The hum grew louder, building into a roar that vibrated through his chest cavity. The sidewalk trembled faintly. Heads began to turn. Patrons on the bar's patio looked up, squinting against the sun. Mark Spike Kowalski stood from his seat, shading his eyes with a heavily tattooed hand. What the hell? The first gust of wind came like a slap, sending napkins flying, toppling half-empty drinks. Dust and leaves whirled into the air. Then it appeared. A sleek, matte black Black Hawk helicopter descended over the block like a god in motion. Its rotors hammering the air, its presence shaking the very bones of the city. It hovered low above the street, scattering papers, setting off car alarms, drawing screams and shouts from startled civilians. Traffic screeched to a halt. Phones emerged from pockets like weapons, recording every second. Within seconds, the once indifferent sidewalk had become a stage. The helicopter lowered with precision into a disused loading zone beside the bar. No sooner had the wheels kissed asphalt than a black Suburban with government plates slid into position in front of the bar, its doors flung open. 4 men in tactical gear spilled out with fluid terrifying efficiency, olive drab uniforms, helmets, body armor, eyes shielded by polarized lenses. They didn't yell. They didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. Their silence was louder than sirens. They moved with purpose, one securing the perimeter, two watching the crowd, and one heading straight for the stone bench, where Hank sat unmoving, his hands folded like a monk at prayer. From the rear of the Black Hawk, a ramp dropped with a hiss of hydraulics. A man stepped into the sunlight. Commander David Whitaker. His flight suit was tight to his frame, his stride clean and controlled. The kind of man who didn't demand attention, he absorbed it. The bar fell silent. The street, the traffic, the wind all faded beneath the thunder of his boots on pavement. He didn't glance around, didn't scan for threat. His focus was singular. He walked straight to the bench and dropped to one knee. "Dad," he said, his voice steady, controlled, dangerous. "Are you all right?" Hank met his son's eyes. "Just the hip," he replied. "But it's not the first time I've been knocked off my feet." David turned his head slowly toward the bar. The moment his eyes landed on Spike, the biker paled. The scorpion tattoo on his neck seemed to shrink under the weight of that stare. "Which one?" David asked. Hank tilted his chin slightly, just enough. David rose to full height. Two members of the tactical team moved immediately, not aggressively, just directly. They flanked the patio, their presence freezing the desert vultures mid-laugh, mid-swig, mid-smirk. Spike stood paralyzed. His eyes darted from the team to David to the hovering Black Hawk. A murmur passed through the crowd. The man who had shoved an old veteran moments ago was now shrinking under the scrutiny of the U.S. Army's elite. More sirens began to wail in the distance, local police now rushing to the scene that was already under control. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He took a step forward and addressed Spike with calm, razor-edged clarity. "You assaulted a decorated Army veteran," he said, "an 84-year-old man who gave this country 3 decades of his life. Today, in front of dozens of witnesses, you made the mistake of thinking he was alone." Spike opened his mouth, but no sound came out. One of the SEALs rested a hand on his shoulder. Not violently, just there. It was enough. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, weighted with respect and consequences. The biker didn't flinch at first, but everyone saw the blood drain from Spike's face. Commander David Whitaker didn't blink. "Name?" he asked flatly, still facing him. "Spike. I mean Mark Kowalski," the biker stammered, his bravado now a distant memory. David's jaw tightened. "You shoved an 84-year-old veteran to the ground. That veteran is my father. You're about to learn what accountability looks like." Spike tried to speak again, but one of the tactical officers stepped between him and the rest of the group, quietly positioning himself like a steel wall. The onlookers, many of whom had initially ignored the incident, were now fully invested. Phones were still recording. A few gasps escaped the growing crowd. The image of Hank Whitaker sitting quietly bred beside him while a Black Hawk roared above and elite soldiers formed a perimeter had become something else entirely, a symbol of something long overdue. One of the bar patrons, a young woman in scrubs, approached cautiously. "I saw the whole thing," she said to David. "He pushed him. No warning, just shoved him like he was trash." David gave a short nod. "Thank you, stick around for the police." As if on cue, the first squad car screeched into view. Lights flashing, sirens dying down as officers stepped out and immediately froze at the scene. The helicopter, the armored team, the armed men, the bar full of stunned witnesses. One officer, a captain by his markings, stepped forward, carefully reading the air, like a man who had no desire to misstep. David walked over and extended his hand with military precision. "Commander David Whitaker, U.S. Army. Off duty but responding to an emergency call from my father." The captain returned the handshake, eyebrows raised. "Understood, Commander. This your show or mine?" David nodded once towards Spike, still boxed in by 2 SEALs. "That individual assaulted my father. Multiple witnesses. You're welcome to take it from here." The officer turned towards Spike, who was now practically shaking. "You got ID?" he asked coldly. Spike fumbled with his wallet as one of the SEALs reached in and pulled out the license, handing it over in silence. The arrest was clean and uneventful. Spike didn't resist. He didn't speak. The sound of the cuffs clicking shut around his wrist was followed by murmurs in the crowd, some approving, some stunned. A few older men in the crowd removed their hats, nodding at Hank with quiet respect. An older man in a faded Army ball cap took a step forward and saluted him. Hank returned the gesture without rising. Their eyes met, one veteran acknowledging another. The captain addressed the crowd now. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your cooperation. This man will be processed for assault, and we're collecting witness statements now. If you saw what happened, we encourage you to speak to our officers. As more police arrived, the crowd began shifting, still murmuring, still filming. News vans rolled up, reporters spilling out, trying to piece together what had just unfolded. Cameras turned not to the arrested man, but to Hank Whitaker, still seated quietly, his age and wounds barely masking the quiet power he carried in that moment. David returned to the bench, kneeling again. "You good to stand?" he asked. "Think so," Hank said with a grunt. David helped him to his feet. "Let's get you checked out," David said, gesturing toward the black SUV. "Clinic on base will take care of it. And no arguments, old man." Hank cracked a tired smile. "You always did outrank me." A few chuckles escaped the gathered crowd. The SEALs began regrouping. The helicopter powered down its rotors, finally slowing. The tactical team moved with casual discipline, their job done, but the message left behind was anything but casual. As they walked to the SUV, someone in the crowd called out, "Thank you for your service, sir." More followed. A wave of support began rippling through the bystanders, people applauding, some placing hands over hearts, some wiping tears. It wasn't just for David, it was for Hank, for all of them. Because in a single hour, a forgotten man in a worn coat reminded an entire community what honor actually looked like. And in the middle of a street choked with noise and headlines, justice had landed with rotor blades and steel resolve, and most of all with love. By the time David pulled the SUV away from the curb, Hank Whitaker could already see it, dozens of phones raised high, people still filming, still watching. A city street once indifferent had turned into the epicenter of something much bigger. News clips surfaced within hours. Grainy footage of the Black Hawk descending, of SEALs fanning out across the asphalt of Spike in cuffs, and of an elderly veteran sitting calmly on a bench while chaos danced around him. It all hit social media like a hammer. By the time Hank finished getting checked at the base clinic, his name was trending. Hank Whitaker, #respect the veterans. Reporters circled his apartment building. Veterans groups posted tributes. Local TV aired an old photo of Hank in uniform, standing in front of a dusty tank in Korea, grinning with a wrench in one hand. Someone had found it in an archived Army newslet. He hadn't expected any of it, in fact, he tried to avoid most of it. But the moment refused to die, not when it echoed something so deeply felt, so long ignored. Veterans, especially aging ones, came forward in droves to share their own stories. Some had been disrespected, others forgotten. Many, like Hank, had simply learned to live in silence. City Hall called. So did the mayor. And 3 days later, Hank was standing, supported by a cane in David's steady hand, on a stage set up in the park behind the rusty mug. The place where he'd been shoved now bore a modest but tasteful podium and an American flag fluttering against a crisp sky. Hundreds had gathered. Veterans in wheelchairs, families, children holding signs that read, "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker." People who had walked past him for years without notice now lined up to shake his hand. The mayor took the microphone. "We cannot erase what happened here last week, but we can decide what it means going forward." She turned to Hank. "Sergeant Hank Whitaker, for your service, your strength, and the quiet dignity with which you reminded us who we are, we rename this place in your honor." She gestured to the new metal sign affixed to the park's wrought iron arch. "Jenkins Field, dedicated to Sergeant Hank Whitaker and all who served with honor." Hank blinked hard. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he leaned toward the mic and said simply, "I thought I was just picking up bread." Laughter rippled through the crowd, warm and genuine, but it turned to quiet tears when he added, "I never wanted attention. I only wanted to be treated the way we should all treat each other, with respect. That's not a veteran thing. That's a human thing." The applause was thunderous. The days that followed brought more than just recognition. Local schools had added a Veterans Appreciation Week to their curriculum. A mural appeared overnight on a wall near the park, Hank's profile next to the words, "Dignity has no expiration date." The rusty mug, now under scrutiny, changed hands. The new owner, a veteran himself, renamed it the Watchstand and announced it would host weekly free meals for veterans. David, still home on leave, received a call from the Secretary of the Army's office. There was talk of a commendation, possibly even a feature in Stars and Stripes. But he was less interested in the press than in the emails. Hundreds of them. From service members past and present, from children who'd seen the clip in school, from a young man who wrote, "I saw myself in that biker and I hated it. I'm changing." And from the biker himself, Mark Kowalski, the message was handwritten, shaky but sincere. He expressed remorse, not excuses. He asked for a chance someday to apologize in person. Hank read it twice and said nothing, but he didn't throw it away. What began with one disrespectful shove had grown into a reckoning and a reconciliation. As spring bloomed into summer, Hank resumed his Thursday walks. Henderson's Bakery began setting aside a fresh loaf just for him, warm and wrapped with a red, white, and blue ribbon. People greeted him now, not out of obligation but recognition, for what he'd endured, for what he represented. He still visited Jenkins Field once a week, sat on the same bench, watched kids playing in the grass, watched strangers become neighbors. And once, as the sun dipped low, he said to David, "I didn't mean to start anything." David smiled. Sometimes the best revolutions start by accident. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, Hank received another letter, this one without a return address, written in blue ink on lined paper. It was from Mark "Spike" Kowalski. The message was raw, without polish or pretense. Spike spoke of shame, of confronting his reflection and not liking the man who stared back. He confessed the push had been about more than a motorcycle. It had been the eruption of years of anger, confusion, and grief tied to his estranged alcoholic father, also a veteran. He admitted the incident with Hank had shattered something hollow inside him. He ended the letter with a question, "Would you be willing to meet me man to man? Not for my sake, but because I need to face what I did, and maybe start fixing it." Hank waited 2 days before responding with a single sentence, "Friday 2 p.m. Jenkins Field." The meeting was quiet, no cameras, no fanfare. Spike arrived without his biker gear, just jeans, a flannel shirt, and a visible tremble in his hands. Hank sat on the same stone bench. Spike stood a few feet away, silent for a long moment before whispering, "I'm sorry." Hank looked at him, nodded once, and patted the bench beside him. They spoke for an hour, about fathers, about service, about anger. When Spike asked why Hank agreed to see him, Hank replied, "Because we don't fix anything by staying angry, and because someone has to be the first to show respect." From that day forward, Spike began volunteering at the local VA center, cleaning floors, sorting supplies, and listening. Really listening. Veterans who once glared at him eventually started nodding. Some shook his hand. One called him the guy who turned it around. The town noticed. People began visiting Jenkins Field more often, not just to honor a name on a plaque, but to remember what it stood for. Hank's story became a quiet but powerful reminder that respect wasn't a trend. It was a practice, a choice, and sometimes a second chance. Hank Whitaker didn't ask for fame or justice. He asked for dignity. And by holding firm, not with fist, but with grace, he reminded an entire town what honor truly means. Forgiveness doesn't erase pain, but it allows space for something better to grow. If Hank's story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Is there someone you need to stand up for or forgive? Comment below with your thoughts, your story, or a thank you to a veteran who's made a difference. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like Hank's, hit like, subscribe, and share. Let's build a world where respect isn't rare, it's reflex.